Welcome to The Roommate Coach. My name is Mark Lynn. I'm the Roommate Coach, and I'll be your host here on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. My motto is World Peace, one roommate at a time. That's also my goal. Now, it might sound unrealistic, but here's the thing. Unless you live alone, you have a roommate. Now, the roommate may have other titles such as parent, relative, friend, son, daughter, cousin, whatever, but if you're sharing housing, you are roommates. And if by some chance there is any conflict between you or among you that perhaps could be reduced, if you manage to reduce that somewhat, then to some extent that will be an increase, admittedly a small increase in world peace. But here's another really interesting thing. If you think about your house and your living situation as your world, then that could be a tremendous increase in world peace in your world. So maybe a little bit of wordplay, admittedly, but overall, I think it's a valuable goal, and that's why it is the motto here at The Roommate Coach. World peace, one roommate at a time. KZZH is a fairly new low-power radio station here in Eureka, California, brought to you by the wonderful folks over at Access Humboldt. That's accesshumboldt.net on the web. If you'd like to leave me any comments or feedback, you can do so at area 707-362-8000, 707-362-8000. That's a 24-hour voicemail line. Or you can leave any comments at theroommatecoach.com using the contact link on the home page. This is episode 7 of The Roommate Coach. This will be the Roommate Coach background, or how I became the roommate coach. I'm going to talk a little bit about how a seemingly reasonable guy like me wound up doing something so, I'm not sure what the word would be, but perhaps challenging, as trying to figure out how to reduce some of the roommate conflict that goes on in our world. And so I'll talk about how and why I made that decision, some of my background. Now, if you are thinking of trying some of my suggestions here for some of your own roommate issues, I will also include, as part of my background, I will include as much as I can about the things I believe and the things I base my reasoning on. So rather than just take me on faith, you can kind of check things out and make your own decision. And if you find yourself in agreement, or largely so, with my thinking, then you might want to go ahead and give some of my suggestions a try. So that'll be part of the show, is my background and also my, I guess I would say my values, my philosophies, and pretty much what I base my reasoning on. It's all pretty much what I consider reality-based, but I'll explain more here in a few minutes. I'm going to paraphrase a couple of well-known entertainers to start my explanation here of my background. The first one's kind of silly, but it's an old album title of one of Bill Cosby's early albums. He called it I Started Out as a Child, which I thought was rather clever. I guess we all did. I certainly did, and that's where I will start my story of my background. The other artist I'm going to quote is Paul Simon from one of his fairly early songs. I think the song was I Think Too Much, from his Hearts and Bones album, if I recall correctly. And the line is, I had a childhood that was mercifully brief. I grew up in a state of disbelief. And that's pretty accurate. I grew up with a family that had I think, at least its share and possibly more than its share of conflict. As a result of this, I came to a tentative conclusion fairly early in my life that conflict is disruptive. Much of the time it's unnecessary, and I would go so far as to say a lot of it is downright stupid. Now, I'm not saying that the people involved are stupid, and in my case they weren't. My family members were, for the most part, very intelligent people. But they sure hardly ever lacked for something to squawk and fuss and fight about. And that was the beginning. That was the very early beginning of what eventually led me to become the roommate coach, because I have had a long-standing distaste for unnecessary conflict. And I have to say, I think most of it is unnecessary. Maybe not all of it, but a good chunk of it. And that's how it got started, was my my family life. I imagine my response to this situation was pretty similar to that of quite a few others, in that I just got out of there relatively early, and maybe sooner than I would have otherwise, and I think a lot of people do this. Now, this might have been a good move, but I relatively quickly found out a couple of disturbing things. One was that the outside world was kind of a larger version of what my family had been. There was still plenty of what I considered unnecessary and in many cases downright stupid conflict. Now, parenthetically, I'll go back and say that this was really a letdown for me, because for quite some time I had this notion that as soon as I got out on my own, things would be dramatically different. And like I said, I was kind of discouraged to realize that it was more of the same. The other part of the bad news, or the disturbing thing that I began to realize somewhat after I left home, was that I had internalized a lot of this stuff, and I had brought a lot of the tendency for conflict and stuff like that with me. Now, this was probably a turning point for me, because for whatever reason, I was willing to acknowledge that for myself. I don't think this is something that everyone does. I have no way of knowing that for a fact, but that's my best guess. But because I realized that it was not just the outside world, it was also me as well, that left me open for hopefully doing something about it. I had no idea for a number of years, actually. I had really no idea just what to do about it, but I remember fairly early on thinking that if there's anything to be done about this, I'm sure as heck going to give it a try. And as it turned out, I did. One thing I remember clearly about this time in my life is trying to talk about this vague unhappiness and lack of enthusiasm about life that I saw in myself and most people around me. And I tried to find someone to talk to about it. And for the most part, people either didn't know what I was talking about or just didn't want to pursue it. I suspect now, looking back on it, that that's because most of them were feeling the same thing I was and just wanted to keep the feeling under wraps. I think that's a big part of why we have so many distractions in our world, and the various drug and substance problems. But anyway, that would lead into an entirely different conversation, so I'll try and stick to the topic here. But that was one of the first things I tried before I discovered some actual help on the subject. So I was in my late 20s, I think, mid to late 20s, living in Los Angeles, when somebody happened to give me a book by Nathaniel Branden, the pretty well-known psychotherapist. He just died recently at the age of, I think he was 84. But back then, this was a few years after his rather explosive parting from philosopher and best-selling author Ayn Rand. The two had been affiliated professionally and personally, as it turned out, for quite some time. They had created or generated a pretty substantial following. And after they parted company, they were in New York. Brandon moved to Los Angeles and proceeded to set up what turned out to be a very successful psychotherapy practice. And as it happened, when I finished his book. I just happened to be about a mile away from his office, so I was so completely flabbergasted by what I had read that I went to a pay phone, which they still had back in those days, and called him, and I think he answered his phone directly. As it turned out, his secretary was off that day. I made an appointment and went in to see him, I think, the day or two after that, and got into therapy with Nathaniel Branden. That turned out to be probably the single most important decision of my, at the time, young life. And everything has been different since then, no question about it. You're listening to The Roommate Coach on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. My name is Mark Lynn. You can leave any feedback for me at theroommatecoach.com. There's a contact link on the homepage, or you could leave a message at area 707-362-8000. That's 707-362-8000. It's a 24-hour voicemail line. This is episode number 7, and this is calling it the Roommate Coach Background. I'm beginning to think I might have to call it the Roommate Coach Background Part 1, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the whole story in one episode here, but we'll see how that goes. The motto, or my motto, I should say, the motto of the Roommate Coach series is world peace, one roommate at a time. Now, if my motto sounds somewhat unrealistic and perhaps fanciful to you, bear in mind that your world might just consist of yourself and your roommates or whomever you share your home with. So rather than thinking how unrealistic it is to have a peaceful 7 billion people planet, and I would agree that's probably pretty unlikely in the very near future, the way things are going. But if you think about your own world, where you live, and the people you share your home with are part of your world, well, that world can be more peaceful. And that's what the Roommate Coach is all about. So, world peace, however you define the world, one roommate at a time. That's the goal here. I wound up getting into a therapy group with Nathaniel Branden. I think it was at least a year, might have been closer to 2 years I spent in therapy and similar things with Branden and others who had similar messages. I discovered a number of really important things about myself, and I think I made a fair amount of progress, although in some ways, looking back on it, the therapy part of it was almost the least significant. That's not entirely accurate, but for the sake of this discussion, the most important thing I got from my time with Branden is a vastly different outlook on life and its possibilities. I began to realize that, yeah, you really could do something, you could do interesting things with your life. The world is not just a place to struggle and suffer and hope to get by. And that was kind of the message I'd gotten from my family, and I began to realize that was the message a lot of people got from their families or just from the world around them. And that fact was what was bothering me and had been bothering me all this time. And I also began to realize that was probably the basis of an awful lot of the conflict in our world, is that A lot of us were just unnecessarily unhappy and frustrated, and it was a real important beginning for me. Now, I will mention in passing that I'm well aware that Nathaniel Branden, and especially his, I guess you'd have to say, mentor, Ayn Rand, were in many ways very controversial figures, perhaps Ayn Rand more so than Nathaniel Branden, because I think she was probably more widely known. I guess she's still a best-selling author, something like 40 years after her death. I think she died in the early 80s. I think I read somewhere that Atlas Shrugged, her biggest and probably most important book, which was published in 1957, is still selling something like a couple 100,000 copies a year. So she's made quite a name for herself, and she was very controversial, to put it mildly. I think she was in some ways embittered as the years went by. There's all kinds of discussions about Ayn Rand. I do think it's a mistake to ignore everything she had to say simply because some of what she had to say was probably pretty inaccurate or perhaps over the top. But I'm digressing a little bit. I have a rather lengthy quote from one of Nathaniel Branden's books. It was originally titled Judgment Day. He later a later edition was called My Years with Ayn Rand. It was somewhat autobiographical. And there's, like I say, a somewhat lengthy quote that I think does a nice job of just explaining what an amazing message I got from working with him, and apparently quite a few, as in thousands of others, got this as well. So I'll start the quote right here. This is from Judgment Day by Nathaniel Branden. He is talking about the classes, the teaching that he and Ayn Rand did when, I believe they called it the Nathaniel Branden Institute. He was teaching her philosophy to quite a few individuals. There were several thousand people over the years. I think there were classes in 80 cities. But anyway, here's the quote, and I quote, "We had an extraordinary vision to offer, a radiantly rational one, I believed then. Today I'm convinced there are errors in that vision, elements that need to be changed, eliminated, modified, added, or amplified, but I am still convinced there is much in that vision that will stand. We did not tell our students that the mind is impotent. We did not tell them that they were rotten or powerless. We did not tell them that life is futile, or that they were doomed, or that existence is meaningless. We told them just the opposite. We told them that their main problem was that they had not learned to understand the nature of their power, therefore of their own possibilities. We told them that their mind was and could be efficacious, that they were competent to understand, that genuine knowledge was attainable, that achievement and happiness were possible. We told them that life was not about dread, defeat, and anguish, but about struggle, triumph, and exaltation. This message ran counter not only to the dominant religious and philosophical teachings most of them were exposed to, but, no less important, it ran counter to the teachings of most of their parents. Their parents who said, 'So who's happy? Pride goeth before a fall. Adventure is for the comic strips. Who do you think you are, Buck Rogers? Real life is learning to make your peace with boredom. Life is not about exaltation. Life is about duty.' And then along came Ayn Rand, who said, 'Oh, really?' and proceeded to create characters who did not live in the Middle Ages or in outer space, but who were of our time and of this earth. Characters who work, struggle, pursue difficult career goals, fall in love, participate in intensely emotional relationships, and for whom life is a great adventure because they have made it so. Characters who face opposition, endure hardships, suffer, struggle, persevere, and who, predominantly, win." End quote. I think this quotation captures a lot of the spirit or the excitement that Nathaniel Branden brought to his life and his work, and he certainly passed that excitement on to many of his clients, myself included. So here's a brief summary of what I came away from work with Nathaniel Branden, some of the results that I experienced. First of all, I did achieve a reduction in some of my emotional issues. I don't know if I cleared them up entirely. I don't know if it's possible. I don't believe I did, but I certainly helped them. As a result of that, I became a pretty big advocate of therapy. And I have to say, I was kind of surprised some years afterwards when I began to encounter a lot of negative attitudes about therapy itself, about psychotherapy. I began to realize that I had been rather fortunate in my choice of therapist, because Branden was, by definition, pretty much a maverick in the mental health community. There was never, among any of his clients, there was never any suggestion of going to get some medications. Now, I realize psychologists don't prescribe, it's psychiatrists, but if a psychologist thinks you need medications, he can certainly send you to someone. And for all I know, the laws may have changed, but that wasn't even the point. Branden's approach was just different. He believed that we were stronger and more capable than we pretty much gave ourselves credit for, and his job was to encourage us to find that stronger part of us. And I benefited greatly from that, no question about it. There's no way to prove it, the road not taken and everything, but I do suspect that had I gone to a more traditional therapist, or if I had gone to someone today, in my last show, in episode 6, I did some quotations about some articles discussing how the mental health community, how the attitudes have changed in the last several decades. And nowadays, it's a lot more likely that if you go to a therapist, that there's a good chance you'll wind up with a label of some sort and possibly some medications, neither one of which I think would have been appropriate for me, and I probably would have been turned off by the experience. So that's the first thing that I got from the experience, is I came away feeling much better about myself than I had before. Another result for me of working with Nathaniel Branden is I came away with the idea firmly implanted in my young brain that my life was in fact important, and I really could do something of value with it, and it would be a shame for me to just pretty much go through the motions and just kind of go along with whatever slot society has for me, that I really wanted my life to matter. In many ways, my life would have been simpler if I had chosen a more traditional career path, but the thought of making something of your life, or at least in my case, of my life, that's one of those bells that there is no way to unring it once you have heard it rung. Now, there's another thing that I got from working with Branden and some others that's probably most relevant to my current incarnation as the roommate coach. And this is, I began to realize that the way our societies are structured has an awful lot to do with why so many people are just not all that satisfied with their lives, relatively frustrated, somewhat unhappy, in many cases not willing to talk about it, but a very clear result of all this is an awful lot more conflict than we would be likely to have in a world that put more of an emphasis and more of a priority on individual happiness and well-being. This world, unfortunately, does not, and as a result, we have a lot of conflict, including a lot of roommate conflict. I began to realize all this as a result of working with Nathaniel Brandon. So that's a pretty good indication, or a pretty good brief summary, or the beginnings of a summary of how I became the roommate coach, because taking the notion that my life should matter and combining that with the awareness that a lot of conflict is unnecessary and maybe something can be done about it, well, a real good place to start is being the roommate coach. Anyway, I've condensed the story really quite a bit here, and there's quite a bit more to tell, so I will leave that for part 2. I will go ahead and wrap this one up here. This will be part 1. I think I mentioned at the beginning that I might have to rename it. So let's make it official. You've been listening to The Roommate Coach. I'm Mark Lynn. This is KZZH, only 2 Z's, 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. This has been episode 7 of The Roommate Coach, in which I discussed how I became the roommate coach, my background, and I'm now calling it part 1. Part 2 will be next. The motto here at the Roommate Coach, by the way, is world peace, one roommate at a time. That might seem a little bit naive, but keep in mind, your world consists of where you live and the people you live with. Whatever else you may call them, they're also your roommates. So if that world, which is your world, can become a little bit more harmonious, then that's a little bit more world peace. KZZH has been brought to the air here in Eureka, California by Access Humboldt. They can be reached at accesshumboldt.net. The bumper music is called Rollin' at 5, and that's by Kevin MacLeod. If you have any questions or concerns or just general feedback for me, you can leave that at theroommatecoach.com. On the homepage, there's a contact link, or you could use the 24-hour voicemail system at area 707-362-8000, 707-362-8000. Next time, I'll be talking more about my background and how I became the roommate coach and what that means to you. And this will be part 2. And until then, I hope everything goes well, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon.